This day in sports history. Hey, and welcome to another edition of This Day in Sports History, a member of the Sports History Network. You can find more info and more sports history podcasts at sportshistorynetwork.com. It's October 18th, and on this day in 1924, Harold Red Grange became the Galloping Ghost. Most people who read the sports page in those days knew the name Red Grange. He had exploded on the scene as a sophomore at Illinois in 1923, scoring 3 touchdowns in his first game, which included an electrifying 66-yard punt return for a score. He'd left opponents mesmerized, fans screaming for joy, and writers looking for words to describe what he actually had done. On this day, Grange's Fighting Illini of Illinois were playing at home against mighty Michigan. The Wolverines had a stout defense. They had not been scored on in their first 2 games and would post 5 shutouts in their 8 games in 1924, outscoring opponents 155-54. But on this day, they knew they faced quite a challenge in trying to stop the greatest football player in the country. But knowing what you're facing does not exactly mean that you're going to be able to stop it. Michigan kicked off to start the game in front of a capacity crowd of 66,609, and before a good number of those had been able to find their seats, Red Grange caught the football at his own 5-yard line and took off to the right like he generally did. That's how the blocking was set up. But as 11 yellow-jerseyed Wolverines took a beat on him, Grange swiveled his hips and cut back to the left, leaving everybody intent on tackling him in the dust on the way to a 95-yard touchdown return. But he was just getting warmed up. On the following Illinois possessions, Grange would score on runs of 67, 56, and 44 yards, and he did all of that in the first 12 minutes of the game. Grange's 4 touchdowns were as many as Michigan had given up in the past 2 seasons. Now, back in those days, players played both sides of the football, offense and defense, and if you were subbed out on either side of the ball in the first half, then you could not return until the second half. And so when a sub was sent in to replace him, he was a bit surprised and not exactly happy, but he wasn't one to argue with Coach Bob Zuppke. He did come back in the third quarter, and he scored his 5th touchdown on an 11-yard run. He finished off his day with a 20-yard touchdown pass, and Illinois won 39-14. So Grange figured in every touchdown scored for the Illini. But how about these numbers in his limited time on the field? He had 212 yards rushing, 64 passing yards, and he added 126 yards in return yardage. Now, add all of that up, and that's 402 all-purpose yards for Grange on this day. Chicago sports writer Warren Brown was in the press box that day. In a world without television and where radio broadcasts of college games was in its infancy, newspaper sports writers were the entertainers of the day, and Brown had been following the exploits of Grange since the previous year, and he was looking for just the right words to describe what he had seen on this day. That was a bit unusual. He'd never really been at a loss for descriptive words and phrases. He'd actually been the one to label Babe Ruth as the Sultan of SWAT, and he knew this special kid, this once-in-a-lifetime player, needed a nickname. He'd just watched Grange roll up yard after yard as if he were invisible, as if he was a ghost. And so when Warren Brown wrote his column for the Chicago Herald-Examiner about this game, he labeled Grange's running style as if he was a galloping ghost. On the East Coast that day, covering the Notre Dame Army game, was noted sports columnist Grantland Rice. After he'd written about the Notre Dame's 4 horsemen rolling to a 13-7 win against Army, he learned what Grange had done in Illinois, and he also started thinking of ethereal beings. Rice enjoyed writing short poems, and he would add those into his column, and he penned this one to describe Grange in a game that he did not see. A streak of fire, a breath of flame, eluding all who reach and clutch, a gray ghost thrown into the game that rival hands may never touch, a rubber-bounding, blasting soul whose destination is the goal. Red Grange of Illinois. Grange's performance on this day vaulted him from a guy that some knew to a guy that everybody knew. More was to come from the Galloping Ghost in the coming years, and we'll talk about a lot of those things on future editions of This Dish. But let's talk more about Red Grange and not only what he did on this day, but in the years after. And joining me now is Doug Villhard, the author of the new book about Grange titled The Golden Age of Red, a novel of Red Grange, The Galloping Ghost. It's available in paperback or Kindle on Amazon and as an audiobook on Audible. Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
First, you make it known in your book that this is a work of fiction, historical fiction. Why did you choose to go that route with your book about Red Grange's life?
Yeah, that's right. And, there's a lot of nonfiction books written about football and about Red, and I think that they're great. But if I'm being honest, though, a lot of those books just tell you what happened, like how many yards and what the weather was like and those types of things. I really wanted to get into why and how it felt to have all this stardom on this young man. So historical fiction or historical biographical fiction, it is a book, but it kind of reads like you're watching the movie. And that's how I like to tell stories.
Well, since this is a podcast called This Day in Sports History, let's talk about what Grange specifically did on this day 100 years ago. It really was the game that vaulted him to a nationally known figure.
Yeah, that's right. And, so he had, this was his junior year. By the way, back then you couldn't play your freshman year. Isn't that interesting? You could only, so it really only had 3-year careers. So he was an All-American as a sophomore. But here he is on this day when the reigning national champion, Michigan, is coming in. But Illinois is trying to dedicate their stadium. So they got 67,000 people there. But they're not expecting to win, per se, against this powerhouse team. By the way, Michigan in the prior 2 years hadn't lost a game and had really only given up 1 or 2 touchdowns. Really, really less than 30 points in 2 years. So the powerhouse coming in. And then, right off the bat, Red receives the ball, the kickoff from the 5-yard line, and runs it back for a touchdown, right? So, they've only had like 1 touchdown in 2 years, and he scores one immediately. And then it was a little different then. They instead of, in today, Michigan would then get the ball, but they had different rules. Michigan elected to kick off again. They kicked it right back to him because they preferred field position. Oh, they said that was a fluke. 2 plays later, Red scores again, and then again, and then again. It's 28-0 in the first 12 minutes. And, Sports Illustrated still calls that the most unforgettable moment in sports. It's just fantastic. And then, of course, he scores 2 more touchdowns in the second half and has 2 interceptions, too, because they played offense and defense. Over 400 yards. So it was just an amazing performance, single-day performance. And yes, he then became, at that time, more famous than Babe Ruth after doing this.
So Michigan did not change their game plan at all? They kept kicking the ball to Illinois.
Yeah, because this had not happened before. They're like, surely that's not going to happen again. And and it was also the rules were different, which would be fun to talk about, but including people often punted on first downs. They just catch you off guard and kick it down the field and then try to pin you down in your area, hope for a fumble. And you couldn't really have long passes like we do today because the ball was like bigger, like a rugby ball, like a volleyball. You just can't throw it very far and it's wobbly. So it was very much a game until Red, actually, of get the biggest farm boys possible and run them up the middle. That was the game. But then think of Red like a track star, basically, and just broke this wide open.
The well-known sports writer Grantland Rice has often been mistaken as the one who gave Red his nickname, the Galloping Ghost. But Red always said it was Warren Brown who had penned the moniker, and that was one thing you really wanted to kind of set straight in your story.
That's right. And so Warren was a reporter out of Chicago, and Grantland Rice was a national reporter. And Warren is a great historical figure too. And he had an incredible beat because he had Illinois and he had the Bears too, right? At the same time, so it was really neat. But yeah, everybody had a name. So like Babe Ruth was like the Bambino and Sultan of SWAT, and Man of War. At the time, the horse had nicknames, and the boxers had nicknames, and Bobby Jones was the Georgia Peach, and Kid Blackie, like everybody had a nickname, so they needed one for Red. And he had this. I mean, when you watch him on film, what'll happen is he'll sort of disappear like into the scrum of players, like a surfer going under the wave, basically. And then you're just waiting for like the play to end, and all of a sudden, bam, he's out the other side and gone. And that's really where that Galloping Ghost nickname came from. It's like reaching out for like a mist, an apparition, and you just can't grab it. And it really looks like that when he's running out there too. So yes, that's where that nickname came from.
And it seemed like a perfect descriptor for exactly what he was doing on the field. I mean, that elusive, he couldn't be caught, and people were just grasping at air.
And I think it was very hard at the time when most running plays got you a yard. And then this guy could suddenly break free for a 60-yard run. It just wasn't, it just changed the way that the game worked. It would be like, reminds me of like Steph Curry just like crossing the half line and then making the shot, from so far out. We just hadn't seen that regularly before. And that's kind of what Red did for this game. And by the way, football's a lot more fun when people are scoring too. And it was a very tight game. Like most games were like 3-6, right? Until Red Grange kind of broke it open. So he really, really brought a lot of fans into the game.
This is your third book that you've written, but the first with your focus on sports or a sports figure. What was it that drew you to wanting to write a novel about Red Grange and this time in history?
Yeah, so I'm an entrepreneurship professor, business professor at Washington University in St. Louis. So I'm actually drawn to entrepreneurs. So even though this is a sports book, my first two books were about an entrepreneur around the time of the 1904 World's Fair at the largest women's magazine in the world. And he was a very interesting character. And I like to take what I teach in class and do that through historical figures. Even though this book is about football and Red Grange, it's not what drew me to it. It was actually, not only was Red awesome, but he partnered with what is known today as the first sports agent in C.C. Pyle. So it was actually C.C. Pyle that drew me to this story, and the way that he saw this amazingly famous kid in college and C.C. Pyle was running movie theaters in Champaign, Illinois, where the University of Illinois is located. And he saw this kid, he's like famous right there. And C.C. Pyle kind of had a vision for how Red's career could go. So it was actually that mind of that entrepreneur, of that promoter that drew me to the story.
And that transitions into my next question, which, Grange went on to play in the NFL after his time in Illinois, and the 1920s were the early days of the NFL. And his decision to go play for the Chicago Bears was met with disdain, and he was vilified for actually wanting to play professionally. What was it that ultimately led to him making that decision?
Yeah, and let me walk you through why people weren't going to the pros back then. So if you play at college, this part is still true today, is then you're playing on Saturday to like 67,000 people, or at Ohio State at the time, 85,000 people. So it was a very popular game in college, but it wasn't outside. And the main reason was because it was created in colleges, and not a lot of people went to college, actually. So you had to and there was no television. So you had to be in college to get it. So at this time, Illinois is selling out these stadiums. But the Chicago Bears, fledgling team getting started, is only drawing 3,000 people to NFL games. And they're paying because they don't have any money, they're paying players like $50 a game to play. So when these college graduates graduate, they're better off to get a job, than to play college. The economics were different. So what was interesting about C.C. Pyle is he said, you know what? I think the NFL could be something. I think it could sell out. He saw the vision. He said, but it's missing a Babe Ruth. It doesn't have a star. It needs a star. So what was interesting about CC Pyle is he went to the owner of the Bears, and and he said, the Bears owner said, listen, we've been paying people $50 a game. We'll pay Red $500 a game. And on his own, Red would have taken that and said, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But CC Pyle said, that's a place to start in the negotiation. He said, how about this? He said, look, you're only drawing 3,000. Red draws 60,000. If Red plays for you, you're going to have 60,000. How about instead we split it? So not $500 a game, half the gate. That's what he negotiated for Red, half the gate. And then when they played in New York, Red got half the gate. He made more money in one game than Babe Ruth made all season, and Babe Ruth was there to have to watch it too. And by the way, after CC Pyle, the all leagues banned sports agents from the 1920s until the 1960s because they're too darn powerful. They realized that right off the bat. So it was, I do love Red Grange, and I do love him as an athlete and a person. He's such a humble, nice person. But it was this mind of CC Pyle to like see the future. And, Red Grange is in the Hall of Fame and the first 17 inducted into that class. And they say it wasn't necessarily for being an NFL player, but it was for putting that entire league commercially on the map. And so yeah, I'm so glad we're exploring this day in history, but this day in history then changed the entire landscape of the NFL.
So would the NFL be what it is today, or even be a thing, if it was not for Red Grange?
So here's it's opinion, but what I think would have happened is they were teetering on bankruptcy at that time. And right around the corner, just a year or two later, was the Great Depression. I think it would have wiped out the NFL. But when television comes back around, right, about 15, 16 years later, I think it would have worked out. I think it would have worked out again. TV is there's also people like there's kind of like the violence of it, if you will, in the way that the sport works. But TV made that league. So yes, it would have been very precarious, but I do have a feeling there could have been another star, of the television age. Yes, this would have, there's no question that they would have barely survived. They already barely survived the Depression, but I think Red made the league.
Name, image, likeness is a huge thing in college sports now. But Grange may have been like the first NIL guy. He had kind of an agreement with Pyle his senior year. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. And of course, and that's what I love about this story too. And I love how history repeats itself. So, of course, they didn't call it name, image, likeness then. They called it fame. And what CC Pyle's argument was that Red, you're selling out these stadiums for colleges. In fact, Red is paying tuition to go to school. They don't have athletic scholarships then. So CC Pyle, he's vilified. Really, he's looked like a fly-by-night guy, a scoundrel, all about money. But he really saw himself as a champion of the student athlete. And he's saying, look, you're selling out stadiums. That fame is yours. We should capitalize on it. And Red is a very good and humble human being. And he fought very hard to not take a dime until his last day of playing college football. That was very important to him. But you're right, they were working in the scenes to get ready for him to go pro afterwards. So yes, I do think he's the first pioneer of that. And so much so that they couldn't cash in while he was in college. But he played his last college game on a Saturday, and then he was a pro player the next day on a Sunday. So he had a whole pro season in the same season. He played his college season and pro season same season. He quit school right then. So it was really interesting to see the current debates come up, because they've really been talked about for 100 years, whether this is fair or not, to have these kids selling out stadiums. And it was especially unfair when the kid was actually paying tuition at the same time.
So when you were doing the research for this book, did you come across something that surprised you about Red?
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, I'll answer honestly. There was, but for me, and I hope your listeners would find it interesting too. But I didn't realize that he was I mean, we know he's a star, but I didn't realize that he was a star who never wanted to be a star at all. He wanted to be behind the scenes. He just wanted to be a college graduate and get a job and move on. And then he runs into CC Pyle, who should be behind the scenes, but instead wants to be a star himself. So he runs into this. But what I found most interesting was there was a period in Red's life after his pro career and before he started doing color commentary on television, which he was one of the first, color, Troy Aikmans, right, or whatever. Chris Collinsworth, one of those guys, was this period of time where he owned his own insurance company. And he's actually most proud of those 10 years where he just went to work, did his job, and went home. And I think that's what's really interesting about this guy. Sometimes this fame and sort of talent is given to people who didn't necessarily want it or want to exploit it. So I find that to be the most interesting part of him, because in today's age, everybody wants to be the star, but he really didn't. And then he ended up, a guy who didn't ends up pioneering how that works for everybody else.
Well, Doug, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate you joining me today on the podcast to talk about your book, The Golden Age of Red. And I'm assuming that Amazon would be the best place to get it.
Yeah. And if people aren't readers, which happens, the audiobook is really a lot of fun. The actor who does it does a lot of different voices, and there's some old time radio shows stuff shows on it. But I think readers would really enjoy not just learning more about Red Grange and the origin of football, but just really immersing themselves into that time period. So thanks for the opportunity to see if we can get a couple more people to learn about Red Grange.
Well, that's Doug Villhard, the author of The Golden Age of Red, a novel about Red Grange, the Galloping Ghost, available on Amazon as a paperback or on Kindle and as an audiobook on Audible. So make sure you check it out. And rolling right along with today's episode, also on this day in 1974, Nate Thurmond recorded the first quadruple double in NBA history. At this point in his career, Nate the Great was in his 12th year in the league. He'd spent the first 11 years with the Warriors, and this was his debut game with the Chicago Bulls. I mean, talk about impressing your employer with your skills on the first day, right? The Bulls were playing the Atlanta Hawks, and Thurmond dominated every aspect of the game, scoring 22, pulling 14 rebounds, he dished 13 assists, and he blocked 12 shots. Now, one thing to know is that the league did not track blocked shots prior to the 74 season, so it is possible that perhaps Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain may have unofficially done it in the decade previous, but Thurmond's is the first recognized quadruple-double in the NBA. It's only been done 3 times since, with San Antonio Spur David Robinson the last to record one back in 1994. But fellow Spur Victor Wembanyama came close in his rookie season, and he may be the next to do it. So if he does accomplish that at some point in his career, you can amaze your friends with the knowledge that Nate Thurmond did it first in his Bulls debut on this day, back in 1974. And on this day in 1977, New York Yankee Reggie Jackson became Mr. October, hitting 3 home runs in a World Series game. And this wasn't just any World Series game, it was Game 6 between the Yankees and the Los Angeles Dodgers, with New York leading the series 3-2. Jackson came to the plate in the 4th inning, and he parked Bert Hooton's first pitch into the right field seats for a 2-run shot to give the Yankees a 1-run lead. He came back to the plate in the 5th inning and delivered another souvenir to the right field seats for another 2-run home run, this one off Elias Sosa. That extended the Yankee lead to 3. And then when he came to the plate in the 8th inning, the entire Yankee Stadium crowd was chanting his name, Reggie, Reggie. and he hit Charlie Huff's first pitch to deep center field for his third homer of the game and his fifth of the series. The Yankees won the game 8-4, won the series 4-2, and Jackson was named MVP of the series and, soon after, known as the man who could hit when it counted in the postseason as Mr. October. And time now for today's Got Nothing to Do with Sports fun fact. During the Great Depression, Al Capone opened up a soup kitchen to feed the homeless and the hungry. He rented out a storefront and opened up a soup kitchen at 935 South State Street. His soup kitchen served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to an average of 2,200 Chicagoans every single day. That's all I've got for you today. A special thanks to Doug Villhard for joining me today to talk about Red Grange and his book, The Golden Age of Red. You can check it out on Amazon and the audiobook on Audible. I've put a link in the show notes for you as well. And make sure to check back in tomorrow for another tour around the history of sports on This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.